An old woman raised a bear cub in secret. When it returned, no one believed what happened next. The wind moved like a ghost through the trees, low and mournful, its voice threading between the trunks of ancient pines that surrounded the weathered cabin like sentinels. Snow had been falling since before sunrise, thick and steady, wrapping the valley in silence and secrecy. Inside the cabin, warm light flickered against log walls, and the faint scent of pine smoke curled through the air. Edith Monroe, wrapped in a wool shawl and worn slippers, stirred her tea with slow, thoughtful hands. She sat in her rocking chair by the fire, the old floor creaking in rhythm with her motion, a lullaby only solitude could hear. At 80, Edith had grown used to the quiet. It had not always been that way. Once, the house had held laughter and footsteps, garden songs and supper prayers. But now, it held memories stored in the groaning joints of the floorboards and the soft dent in the cushion beside her, where no one sat anymore. The radio was off. The phone hadn't rung in days. Her world had shrunk to the size of her cabin and the snowy path she kept shoveled to the woodshed. Yet, even in solitude, Edith found her rhythm, the garden in summer, the preserves in fall, the firewood in winter. Days passed in soft repetition, punctuated only by the occasional visitor from town who came with groceries or kind eyes. Most called her eccentric. A few called her wise, but they all spoke of her with the same quiet reverence reserved for the old trees and the mountain itself. She had been sipping her tea when she first heard it, a sound so faint she almost dismissed it as wind or her own heart ticking in her chest. But it came again, a small, high cry, thin as wire, cutting through the hush of the snowfall. Edith paused. The fire snapped. Her breath caught in her throat. Setting her cup down, she rose stiffly, her joints reluctant but familiar with the cold. She pulled on her coat, fingers trembling against buttons that hadn't been mended in years, and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a slap. Snow swirled in soft flurries beneath the porch light, and the air smelled of pine and silence. She followed the sound, each step slow and deliberate, her slippers sinking into the powder with a wet hiss. The crying grew louder near the woodshed, thin and desperate, almost like a baby's wail. She turned the corner, her lantern's yellow glow carving away the dark, and froze. There, pressed against the shed's wooden wall, lay a bear cub. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its fur was the color of cinders, soft and curled like smoke around its small frame. It trembled violently, blood seeping from a wound along its side, staining the snow dark. One paw twitched. Its eyes, wide and glassy, met hers. No mother. No other tracks. Just faint impressions that led into the forest, already fading beneath the falling snow. Edith didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the bite of cold against her legs, and reached out. The cub flinched but didn't resist. It was too weak. Carefully, she slid her arms beneath its trembling body. It was surprisingly light. "It's all right, baby," she murmured, the words coming out in a breathless hush. "You're not alone anymore." She carried it inside, her arms aching from the effort, and laid it near the fire on an old quilt she hadn't used since her husband died. The cub didn't cry again. Its breathing was shallow, eyes fluttering between sleep and pain. She fetched a bowl of warm goat milk from the cellar, something she kept more from habit than need, and found an old baby bottle in the back of a drawer. It had been there for years, though she'd never had children of her own. She cleaned the wound with warm water and iodine, her hands steady despite the trembling in her chest. The cub drank slowly, weakly, its body relaxing as warmth seeped into its bones. She sat beside it, watching the fire's light dance in its gray fur. "Ash," she said softly. "That's what I'll call you. Ash, for the color of your coat, for the fire you have survived." The next day, she cleared out a corner of the barn behind the house. It had once held goats and chickens, long gone now. She lined the stall with hay, blankets, and a few old coats. Ash took to it quietly, never growling, never pacing. He watched her with eyes that seemed too knowing, too gentle for a creature of the wild. Days passed, then weeks. The snow deepened, and Edith made fewer trips to town, choosing instead to stay by the fire with Ash nearby in the barn. Each morning, she would check on him, feeding him warm milk mixed with oats, brushing the snow from his thickening fur. He grew quickly, stronger with each sunrise, but he never turned wild. He remained silent, always listening. In the evening, she would sit on a stool beside him, wrapped in her shawl, and speak. She told him of her youth, of the dancing hall in town and the lake she used to swim in. Of her husband who died too young, of the child they never had. Of dreams she had once carried in her chest like lanterns, and how she'd learned to set them down one by one. Ash listened. By early spring, he was the size of a deer, his frame solid beneath the silver-gray fur. He moved with a calm grace, never aggressive, never fearful. But the air was changing. The trees began to drip. The snow melted in soft rivulets down the hill, and with the thaw came new danger. Word came through the postmistress. Wildlife officials were moving through the region. Reports of a bear sighting near the edge of town. One farmer's chicken coop had been raided. They'd be setting traps and bringing tranquilizer guns. Edith nodded quietly, her heart sinking like a stone. That night, she walked out to the barn. Ash stood at the doorway, watching her. "They'll find you," she said simply. "And they won't understand." He blinked slowly and calmly. At dawn, she led him into the woods. They walked in silence, her footsteps crunching through old snow, his nearly soundless. They passed the creek, now swollen with meltwater, and the old bent pine where she had carved a heart beside her husband's initials so many years ago. The world smelled of thaw and moss and endings. When they reached a clearing far from any trail, Edith stopped. Her breath curled in the morning air. Ash stood beside her, his fur ruffling in the wind. She turned to him, placed a hand gently on his chest. "It's time," she whispered. "You don't belong to me. You never did." He leaned into her touch for a moment, just a moment, and then stepped back. He looked at her, his eyes deep and still, and she saw no fear in them, only understanding. Then, without a sound, he turned and slipped into the trees. She stood there, long after he disappeared, the sound of the wind through the branches the only thing left behind. The forest swallowed him like a secret. Even as the last whisper of movement faded into the trees, Edith stood in the clearing, the cold seeping into her boots, her hands still hovering where Ash's chest had been. A heaviness settled in her chest, not the sharp ache of regret, but the quiet weight of farewell. The kind that comes when you know you've done the right thing, and yet it feels like tearing a page from the last chapter of your story. The woods, once familiar, now felt hollow in his absence. She turned and began the walk home alone, her gait slower, the air around her somehow quieter than before. That evening, she left the barn door open a little longer than usual. Not out of hope, she told herself, but habit. Still, she paused in the doorway, glancing into the shadows as if they might give him back. They didn't. Days passed, then weeks. Spring unfurled across the valley in soft greens and sudden bird calls. The snow receded, revealing the bones of the garden and broken branches that would need clearing. Edith busied herself with the season's rituals, planting, mending, cleaning, but everywhere she looked, she saw echoes. The spot near the porch where Ash once lay chewing a branch. The path worn between the barn and the house. The way the wind still carried the faintest scent of pine and fir, if she stood still long enough. Summer followed like it always did, and then came fall with its orange hush. By the time the first frost kissed the garden, Edith had almost convinced herself not to think of him every morning. Almost. But the heart, she'd learned, is a stubborn archivist. It holds on long after memory grows soft. Years passed like pages turned by an unseen hand. Edith aged quietly. Her steps grew slower. Her tea took longer to steep. The visits from townfolk became less frequent, and she welcomed the solitude like an old companion. There were rumors, of course, strange ones. A hunter claimed he saw a bear with silver fur standing still as a statue near the creek, watching him without menace before vanishing into the mist. A group of campers swore they were followed for hours by something large that never made a sound, that never showed itself, but whose presence felt like protection rather than danger. A child spoke of a dream where a giant gray bear lay beneath her window, humming lullabies she didn't understand. Edith listened when these stories were told at the post office or passed along by radio crackle. She didn't comment. She only nodded, her eyes distant, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly in something not quite a smile. Then came the winter that seemed to come too soon. The first snow fell hard and fast in early November, catching even the locals off guard. By mid-December, the valley was buried beneath white silence. The cold was cruel that year, sharp, unrelenting. Edith, now in her mid-80s, found herself lighting the fire earlier each morning, her fingers less sure, her bones aching in ways that no quilt could ease. She moved slower, but she moved still, feeding the fire, tending the kettle, and making her rounds through the snow to gather what she could from the shed. On the night everything changed, the sky had turned to steel, and the wind howled against the windows like it wanted in. Edith was drifting to sleep in her rocker, a thick blanket over her knees and the fire crackling low, when something stirred her. Not a sound exactly, not something she could name, just a sense, like the air had shifted, like the house itself was holding its breath. She rose, clutching the edge of the chair, and moved to the window. At first, there was only the dark, then movement, shapes. 3 figures stumbling through the snow toward her porch, their bodies bent against the wind, their steps faltering. Hikers, she thought, young. One collapsed into the snow. Another pulled them up. The third was shouting something she couldn't hear. Behind them, something enormous moved. Edith's hand flew to her heart. A bear. It stood at the edge of the clearing, massive and still, its fur ash-gray beneath the swirling snow. It didn't move, didn't threaten, it simply stood watch. Edith opened the door, her breath catching in her throat. The wind rushed in, biting and sharp. The hiker stumbled up the steps, barely coherent, half-frozen and shaking. She helped them inside, her old hands stronger than they looked. They collapsed near the fire, muttering, "Thanks." Their voices cracked by cold and fear. One of them, a young woman with chapped lips and ice in her hair, grabbed Edith's sleeve and whispered, "It was the bear. It found us. It led us here." Edith turned slowly back toward the open door. The bear still stood in the snow, unmoving. And then it looked at her, the same eyes, the same quiet depth, the scar faint but unmistakable along the side, the one she'd stitched so many winters ago. He held her gaze for a long moment. Snow whirled between them, but she saw him clearly. Then, with a slow turn, he disappeared into the trees without a sound. Ash. She closed the door quietly. Inside, the cabin buzzed with shivering breaths and soft cries. Blankets were piled, tea was poured, the fire roared, but Edith's mind was outside, following the shape as it moved between trees. He had come back. Not for shelter, not for food, but to protect, to guide. She said nothing to the hikers. They would talk later about the miracle, about the bear, about the light they saw through the snow that led them here. But none of them would truly understand what she knew. Ash had remembered. He hadn't just survived the wild. He had carried something of her with him into it. And when the world turned cold again, he returned, not as the lost cub trembling in the dark, but as a guardian, quiet and watchful. The kind that leaves no prints but changes everything in his wake. That night, when the hikers were safe and the fire burned low again, Edith stood on her porch, the storm easing, the snow falling soft now, like feathers. She set a bowl of warm milk just outside the door and turned on the porch light. It glowed against the dark like a small promise. She didn't expect to see him again, but every winter after, on that same night, she left the light on and the milk. Winter passed as all winters do, though that one clung to the valley longer than most. The hikers, once warmed and fed, had been taken back to town by a local search party that arrived the following day. Their eyes wide with disbelief when they heard the story. One of the rescuers, a grizzled man named Lou, who'd grown up in these mountains, looked at Edith when the tale was told and simply said, "Could have been worse if he hadn't been there." As though the idea of a bear saving anyone wasn't so strange after all. Edith said little, her voice soft, her answers simple. But deep inside her, her heartbeat was something fierce and steady, like a song she hadn't heard in years. In the days that followed, she found herself watching the woods more often, not with expectation but with reverence. She left the bowl of milk out again the next night, and the next. And though it remained untouched each time, she continued, not out of habit, not even hope, but out of something older, something that lived in the quiet places between memory and faith. Spring came slow, coaxed from the trees by warmer breezes and returning birds. The garden, which had slept beneath snow and silence, stirred beneath her hands. Edith moved with care, slower now but precise, as though every task deserved attention. She planted onions, carrots, beans in neat rows. She spoke to the soil as she had always done, telling its stories of old times, of Ash, of what it meant to be remembered. The townsfolk came around more often after the rescue. Curiosity drew them first, but kindness kept them. Some brought firewood. Others brought jam, old jam, blankets, letters written in looping cursive from people she hadn't seen in decades. One boy, no more than 10, asked her outright, "Did you really live with a bear?" She smiled, handed him a warm cookie, and replied, "Only for a little while." In town, the story turned to legend. A great gray bear, scarred and silent, who watched from the trees, who led the lost home, who disappeared like smoke. Some said it wasn't real, just fear playing tricks on freezing minds. Others swore they'd seen him, or at least signs of him. Massive paw prints by the river, claw marks on old trees, scat left like a signature at the edge of someone's property. The bear became myth, a guardian of the valley, a story whispered beside fireplaces and over hot cider. But for Edith, it wasn't a legend. It was a promise, a bond sealed by a thread invisible but unbreakable. The summer after that fateful night was the warmest in years. Edith tended her garden, mended the barn's leaky roof, even painted the porch railings a soft shade of blue. She still kept mostly to herself, but something had changed. There was more light in her eyes, more steadiness in her hands. Her rocking chair no longer felt quite so empty. And yet, time moves as it must, like wind through trees or water down mountain slopes. Another winter came, then another. The years began to collect like fallen leaves, subtle and constant. Edith's body softened, grew frilier. Tasks, once done with ease, now took the morning, sometimes the whole day. Her hands, once nimble, curled slightly with age, and her breath came shorter in the cold. But the fire still burned, the tea still steeped, the porch light still glowed on that one night every year without fail. And always beside it, the bowl of warm milk. Some winters, she would find it frozen and untouched. Other times, the milk was gone by morning, the bowl licked clean, a single paw print pressed gently into the snow beside it. She never saw Ash again, not truly. But once, on a still January night, she heard the snow crunch in the trees beyond her window. Not the hurried scramble of a deer, not the light flutter of foxes, a slow, heavy tread. She rose from her chair, walked to the window, and looked out into the darkness. And though the forest revealed nothing, she whispered, "Good night, Ash," and felt somehow that he heard. Another year passed, then another. The mountain didn't change, not in the ways people did. The pine stood tall, the river ran clear, and the wind told the same stories it always had. But Edith grew slower. Her walk shortened. The garden shrank. She began to forget little things, where she'd left her book, if she'd salted the soup. But she never forgot Ash, never forgot the feel of his fur under her fingers or the weight of his head against her lap. She never forgot the look he gave her that day in the woods. The moment he turned back and then vanished into the trees was burned into her memory like firelight on a winter wall. That final winter, when the snow came early and deep, Edith's hands could no longer light the stove without trembling. Her steps through the cabin were soft as moth wings. And still, on that one night, when the wind howled just as it had all those years ago, she lit the porch light. She warmed the milk. She placed the bowl just outside the door and sat quietly in her chair, wrapped in layers of old wool and silence. The fire cracked softly, echoing in a house that felt more like memory than wood and stone. And outside in the trees, something watched. Not close, not threatening, just present, waiting. That night, snow fell thick and slow, like feathers from some great sleeping sky. The light from the porch made a golden pool in the white, and beside it, the bowl sat, steam curling into the cold. Just before dawn, the milk was gone. One paw print remained, pressed like a farewell into the snow. Inside, Edith stirred in her chair, eyes fluttering open, a smile curling faintly on her lips. She felt warm, though the fire had gone low. The wind pressed gently at the windows. Her breathing was soft and even. Outside, the print began to fill with falling snow, the edges blurring as day crept over the valley. The forest remained still. When the townspeople came a few days later, brought by silence, by instinct, by the sense that something had changed, they found the cabin peaceful, the fire cold, but the air still warm, the teacup empty beside the rocker. Edith was there, sitting as if asleep, her face serene, the shawl pulled around her like a blanket of dreams. They spoke in hushed tones. They laid flowers on the porch. They cried, some of them, though not for sorrow, for gratitude, for beauty, for something they didn't fully understand. And later that night, when they returned to town, one boy looked back toward the cabin and gasped. For just a second, at the edge of the trees, something moved. A massive shape, gray fur like smoke, a head bowed low, then rising, watching, then gone. That year, the legend of the gray bear became something more. A tale not just of rescue but of love, of a bond that crossed the wild in the years. Of a woman who gave everything to save a life and was never forgotten for it. And still, to this day, if you venture into that valley near the Canadian border, where the mountains keep secrets and the snow falls thick, you might find a small cabin still standing, the porch light flickering to life on a single winter night. And beside it, a bowl of milk steaming in the cold, waiting. The valley had a long memory. Even after Edith's passing, the wind moved through the pines with a gentler hush, as though mourning someone it had come to know. Snow still fell each winter, deep and silent, covering the earth like a quilt stitched in white. The cabin remained stoic and weathered. Its porch leaning a little more with each year but still standing, still holding the shape of a life lived within its walls. The rocking chair stayed by the window, untouched, a thin layer of dust gathering only in the corners where light didn't reach. After her funeral, the townspeople had not spoken loudly of what they had seen or felt. There was reverence in their silence, a shared understanding that some stories were not meant to be dissected or doubted. The boy who had seen the bear at the edge of the trees never told anyone again. But he returned each year with his father to shovel the snow from the porch and sweep out the hearth, and once he brought a bowl of milk. He left it where he remembered it should go, right by the door. In the morning, it was gone. No one said anything. No one needed to. The legend lived quietly, like Edith had folded into the breath of the mountains, into the way the frost clung to the window panes, into the light that sometimes flickered at night when no one was there. Time passed like a river moving under ice, slow but never stopping. The cabin was left untouched, though many had offers. Some wanted to turn it into a museum. Others suggested tearing it down before the roof collapsed. But each plan fell apart before it could begin, as if something unseen held them back. One spring, a ranger set out to mark trees for controlled clearing and reported that every time he neared the cabin, he felt watched, not threatened, just observed. He left the tags in his truck and didn't return. Another time, a photographer came through chasing rumors of a legendary bear with ash-colored fur. He spent a week in the woods, setting up motion-sensing cameras near deer trails and old berry patches. On the final morning, he packed up with a scowl. "I didn't catch a damn thing," he told the clerk at the general store. But when he returned home and checked his photos, he found one image he hadn't taken himself. It was blurry, overexposed by moonlight, but clear enough to see the faint outline of a bear standing just outside the cabin porch, looking directly at the lens. It was gone by the next frame. He never came back. Every winter, without fail, a light still flickered in the window on one specific night. Sometimes it was the wind knocking something loose. Sometimes it was an old oil lantern that someone had lit and forgotten. But more than once, travelers caught in storms found their way there. Lost hikers, stranded skiers, even a family whose car had broken down on a back road. They always told the same story, a shape in the snow, a bear gray as stone, standing still, watching, leading. They would stumble up the porch steps, half frozen, and find the door unlatched. The fire somehow coaxed back to life, blankets waiting by the hearth. One woman claimed she heard a kettle whistling as she opened the door. Another swore she saw a rocking chair move on its own, as if someone had just left it. None of them could explain it, and no one tried to. The people of the valley knew better than to pull at the threads of something so delicate. What mattered was that the cabin still offered shelter, that the mountain, in its own way, still watched over its own. Years turned quietly and steadily. The boy who had once brought the milk grew older, took over the small grocery his father had run, and had a child of his own. He brought her to the cabin one winter, lifting her high so she could see the mountains. This was her home, he said softly, and maybe, he added with a small smile, still is. The child asked about the bear. He nodded, not confirming, not denying, just giving her space to believe or not. The bowl of milk was left again that year, and again the next. Over time, others joined in. Strangers, travelers, people who'd heard the stories through whispers and wanted to see the place for themselves. They left offerings, not just milk but pine cones, sketches, letters folded carefully into glass jars. A musician once left a violin recording tucked beneath the porch. When a hiker found it and played it back, it was the softest song, something like a lullaby, something that made your chest ache and your eyes sting for reasons you couldn't explain. No one ever stayed long. It wasn't the kind of place to claim. It was sacred somehow, a still point in a spinning world, a place where time folded in on itself and memory lived like breath in cold air. Brief but beautiful, invisible only for a moment. And always, always, there was the story of Ash, the cub who had come to her doorstep half dead, the bear who had walked beside her through loneliness and silence, the guardian who had returned not with words but with presence, who had remembered her when the world had forgotten. In time, children began to draw him, huge and gentle, with eyes like storm clouds and a scar that ran down his side like a river. They gave him different names, but the story stayed the same. The bear who saved the lost. The bear who came when the light was left on. One late winter evening, when the trees stood bare and the sky was deep with stars, a woman in her 60s stood quietly at the edge of the porch. Her name was Nora, and she had been one of the hikers so many years before. Life had pulled her in 100 directions since then, but she had never forgotten the cabin or the way the bear had nudged her gently towards safety, like a mother would guide a child. She came now not because she was lost but because something inside her needed to return. She stood in the snow for a long while, then stepped onto the porch and turned on the light. She sat down a bowl of milk. Inside the cabin, the air was dry and cold. Dust curled through the silence. She didn't stay long, just enough to warm her hands by the old hearth and to leave a note on the table, "Thank you for the light, for the way back." She left the door unlatched, the light still burning. As she disappeared down the path, something moved beyond the trees. A shape, silent and large. It did not step into the clearing. It didn't need to. It was enough to know it was there, watching, remembering, protecting. The bowl remained untouched that night, but the snow around it bore a single print, deep and sky-perfectly formed, as though pressed with care. And in the morning, when the sun rose golden over the valley, the wind carried a sound through the trees. Not a growl, not a howl, but something softer, almost like a hum. The cabin still stands. The light still burns. And sometimes, if the storm is fierce enough, and the traveler is lost enough, and the heart is quiet enough to listen, the path will open. A shape will appear, gray and vast, silent as snowfall, and lead the way. And if you follow it, if you trust the gentle look in its eyes, the scar along its side, the space it makes for you in the cold, you may find yourself not just safe, but home. Because love, once given, does not vanish. It waits. It remembers. It walks with you even when unseen. And sometimes, it returns wearing fur the color of ash, in a silence as warm as firelight. Snow had long blanketed the valley in its rhythm. Season after season, soft and constant, until it seemed as natural as breath itself. Time wore on as gently as frost, shaping the edge of a window pane. And still, the cabin stood, weathered but unbowed, wrapped in silence that was not emptiness but peace. Word of the bear who guided the lost had settled deep into the marrow of local folklore, no longer questioned or analyzed but accepted in the quiet way people accept the shape of mountains or the return of spring. The story became part of the land, as much a feature as the glacial lakes or the crooked birch at the river's bend. Children grew up hearing it by lantern light from grandparents who still remembered the first storm, the bowl of milk, the rocking chair where Edith Monroe sat, watching the snowfall, knowing something precious had once come from the forest and returned to it again. Some said Edith herself had become a kind of guardian, her spirit woven into the trees that surrounded her cabin. Her memory kept alive, not just in tales but in small acts like the lighting of the porch lamp each winter or the gentle placing of warm milk outside the door. Others said it was the bear who carried her memory now, that each time his paws touched the snow-covered earth, he did so not just as a creature of the world but as a bearer of something far more human, love remembered, kindness returned, a bond unbroken. The old path leading to Edith's cabin had all but disappeared beneath underbrush and time. Yet each year, someone found it, often without understanding how. They would be walking a trail and take a turn they hadn't planned, or follow a sound, a branch breaking, a bird call, a hush in the wind, and the trees would part just enough for them to see it, the outline of the old house through a veil of snow, smoke curling impossibly from the chimney as though the fire had never stopped burning. They'd stand at the edge of the clearing, hearts pounding, not with fear but reverence. Sometimes they'd step closer, sometimes they would only watch. Always, they felt changed. And always, somehow, they found their way back home. On a winter morning, many years later, a girl named Maeve arrived at the valley's edge. She was 25, though her eyes had long carried the weight of someone older. Grief had pressed down on her shoulders for 2 years, ever since she lost her brother in a hiking accident not far from the very mountain she now stood before. She hadn't come to find magic. She had come to lose herself. But the land had other plans. Her boots sank into the snow as she walked, not knowing exactly why she followed the trail or where it might lead. All she knew was that something called to her, not a voice, but a feeling. A warmth threading through the cold. The sky above was pale gray, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the silence around her was absolute. Until it wasn't. A shape moved just ahead, gray against white, massive yet quiet as though it belonged to the storm itself. Maeve froze. The bear was not close enough to threaten, but not far enough to ignore. Its fur was ash-colored, its eyes like winter smoke, and for a moment, it simply watched her. Then it turned and walked away, paused, looked back, and walked again. Maeve followed through trees thick with snow and paths buried beneath time. She walked behind the bear, her breath catching in soft clouds. The creature moved at a pace that allowed her to keep up, never too far ahead, never rushing. It felt less like being led and more like being accompanied. She didn't speak, didn't dare. But with each step, the weight in her chest lifted a little, as though something was unraveling, as though someone was waiting. When the cabin came into view, Maeve stopped short. It stood exactly as the story said, slumped slightly under the years, yet somehow untouched, preserved by reverence. The porch light was on. A bowl of milk sat outside the door. The bear stood at the edge of the clearing and watched her approach. Then, without sound, it turned back into the forest and was gone. Maeve stepped onto the porch. The door was unlatched. Inside, the air was still and cold, yet not lifeless. Dust shimmered in the filtered light, and the fireplace, though long since dead, held the faint scent of soot and pine. The rocking chair sat by the window, draped in a thick shawl, its cushions sunken as though someone had only just left. Maeve didn't cry. Not at first. She simply stood in the doorway, heart pounding, eyes wide, as the presence of the place folded around her like a blanket. She set down her pack, knelt by the hearth, and without quite knowing why, began to gather twigs from outside, dry ones, fallen beneath the eaves. She stacked them carefully, struck a match, and coaxed the flame to life. The fire crackled and grew. The cabin exhaled. That night, Maeve sat in the rocking chair and sipped tea she found in a rusted tin, warmed over the fire. She didn't speak aloud, though her thoughts tumbled like river stones. She remembered her brother's laugh, the way his boots had sounded crunching through snow, the way he always left a trail of kindness behind him. She remembered the night she got the call, the way her world had gone quiet in a way that no sound could ever fix. And then slowly, she realized the silence here was different, not empty, sacred. She rocked gently, the rhythm steadying her breath. And in the hush that settled around her, she felt something shift inside, as though the grief had found its resting place, as though it no longer needed to be carried. In the morning, the milk bowl outside was empty. A single paw print remained pressed into the snow. Maeve smiled softly, wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and stepped out into the pale dawn. She didn't rush to leave. She made breakfast from what she could find, swept the floor with an old broom, folded the blanket on the chair. Before she left, she lit the lamp by the window. She took nothing but left behind a note, folded neatly on the table. "I understand now. Thank you." Then she walked back the way she came, not with the aching step of someone who had lost, but with the lightness of someone who had found something too deep for words. The bear was not seen again that winter, nor the next. But the story lived on, passed from lips to hearts, from children to elders, from one lost soul to the next. Some said the bear had gone on to another forest, another place in need of guardianship. Others of them said he still watched, unseen, waiting only for the right moment, the right person. But those who believed truly, those who had felt the hush of the cabin, the warmth in the cold, the miracle of a stranger leading them home, they knew better. They knew love never disappears. It becomes legend. It becomes snow. It becomes the light we follow when we cannot see the path. And sometimes, when the world is silent enough to listen, it returns. Not as a roar, not as a blaze, but as a quiet shape in the storm, walking just ahead, looking back every so often to make sure we are still coming, still holding on.